Harry S. Truman had been the vice president under Franklin D. Roosevelt for just 82 days when FDR passed away. The nation, which was ready for peace after 4 years of war, went into mourning. World War II was still going on, and Truman was thrust into office in the critical closing stages of the conflict. Less than a month into his presidency, with the entire Nazi war machine collapsing, Germany surrendered. They were being crushed from the east and the west and were extremely low on men. Their factories and cities had been bombed, and they lost their central authority with the death of Hitler. With Germany's surrender came some celebration, but the war was not over. There was another country that was not so willing to give up. The same country that killed thousands of Americans in the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. Japan had a different mindset than Germany. Despite being on the verge of military, economic, and industrial collapse, their leadership was determined to fight on until the bitter end. They believed surrender to be a national humiliation, with an emperor who held the cultural and traditional belief that admitting defeat was unthinkable. Japan had hoped to hold some advantage on their homeland when U.S. troops inevitably invaded. If nothing else, they could force the U.S. to offer better peace terms by killing as many of their soldiers as possible and simply making the war too costly, both financially and in terms of lives lost. So Japan was clearly not going to surrender anytime soon, and an invasion seemed necessary, as the United States was committed to an unconditional surrender, especially after Pearl Harbor. Japan wanted to keep their emperor in power, but Truman, nor the American public, was giving Japan any say-so in their surrender. Besides, Japan was not willing to disarm, accept charges of war crimes, or withdraw from occupied territories. The country of Japan needed to be completely reshaped, with a new democracy in place, so worries of another Pearl Harbor could be put out of the minds of Americans. The U.S. wanted to make sure that another war with Japan would never be fought again. Truman realized that he would likely be sending troops into Japan, that is, until another option was presented to him. He was told on April 12, 1945, about a new weapon, an extremely destructive one. As Truman put it in his diary, it's the most terrible bomb in the history of the world. The dropping of such a bomb could immediately put an end to the war, but at the cost of thousands of innocent Japanese lives. The bomb had already been successfully tested with the Trinity test, and some of Truman's advisors suggested that it was the only way to end the war quickly, and in the end, it would save thousands of lives. The traditional option, invasion, looked completely catastrophic. Estimates were given to the president and included 250,000 to 500,000 American casualties, along with millions of Japanese casualties. And that was just one study. Others had as many as 4 million American lives lost in a war that could drag on for years. Japan was preparing for total resistance and were training civilians with bamboo spears. They were preparing pilots for suicide kamikaze missions. The fact that hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of Japanese civilians could be killed in the invasion anyway had to enter into Truman's mind as he considered whether or not to use the bombs. The United States had 2 bombs available, and Truman gave the go-ahead to schedule the dropping of the first, and if Japan still refused to surrender, then the second. And so leaflets were dropped to warn civilians about the upcoming bombs, urging them to evacuate. These leaflets warned that devastating new weapons would be used soon if Japan, who was needlessly dragging the war on, did not surrender. The Japanese government did not take the leaflets seriously and told their citizens that they were simply enemy propaganda. The first target, Hiroshima, had 350,000 civilians and was the headquarters of the Japanese Second Army. On August 6, 1945, at 8:15 a.m., the bomb was dropped 1,900 feet above the city, and the explosion was beyond devastating. Temperatures near the epicenter reached several million degrees Fahrenheit, and the shockwave flattened buildings and destroyed roads, bridges, and railways. 25% of the people in the city, about 80,000 people, died instantly, and tens of thousands more suffered severe injuries, including broken bones, third-degree burns, and radiation sickness. Japan's government was divided in the aftermath, and some members urged for surrender as the war was lost and more bombs could continue to annihilate the country. But there were still hardline leaders who saw surrender as a non-option. The decision was delayed, and Truman was not going to patiently let them debate for long. The original plan was to wait 1 week, but a forecast of poor weather that could have delayed the bombing another 10 days prompted military planners to accelerate the attack and take advantage of the good weather that was available on August 9, 1945. A second bomb was scheduled to drop on the military-industrial city of Kokura. However, due to the clouds and the smoke obscuring the city, the drop was diverted to Nagasaki, a city of 270,000 people. The bomb immediately killed 40,000, and many more died later from burns, trauma, and radiation sickness. Most victims from both bombs were civilians: women, children, students, and factory workers. Shockingly, the hardliners still refused to surrender, but the emperor came to his senses and forced them to accept that they had no choice. America would wipe them completely off the map if they didn't surrender, and on August 15th, Japan surrendered unconditionally, leading to the official end of World War II within 2 weeks. Since the end of the war, people have argued over whether Truman made the right call or not. For those who support Truman's decision, the points are clear. The bombs did end the war quickly, avoiding months or perhaps years of bloodshed. Japan was showing absolutely no signs of surrender despite firebombed cities, a destroyed navy, hunger and starvation, the collapse of industries. They still refused to surrender. The quick end to the war also prevented Soviet influence, as they also had their eyes on Japan. And if the war had lasted just a bit longer, Stalin would have invaded northern Japan and tried to occupy half of the country. The country of Japan could have become a split nation like Germany or Korea. Truman felt immense pressure to end the war quickly for this reason as well, as communism would have spread deeper into East Asia, and a future North Japan versus South Japan conflict could easily have arisen in the future. On the other side of the argument, critics say that Japan was already essentially defeated. As discussed, their cities were rubble, starvation was spreading, their industries were in ruins. Some claim Japan would have surrendered soon even without the bombs, especially with the Soviets on the way. Also, the US could have dropped a bomb as a demonstration on a deserted Japanese island or in a forest area. However, if Japan was not willing to surrender after the first bomb dropped on Hiroshima, they certainly wouldn't have surrendered after dropping a bomb in an empty area. There are also some who say the second bomb was dropped too quickly, just 3 days after the first. If weather concerns required 10 days instead of the planned 7, then they should have waited 10 instead of accelerating it. Japan needed more time to process and understand what a second bomb would mean, and they may have surrendered after Hiroshima alone. But the strongest argument against the dropping of the bombs is, of course, the moral argument. The bombs killed civilians in massive numbers. It was unusual and unnecessary cruelty, and it also gave precedence to such an act. If another country felt nuclear warfare was their best option, they could follow in the footsteps of the United States. And so what do you all think? Was Truman justified in dropping the 2 bombs? Was it completely wrong, full stop? Or is there some compromise in between? In my view, it boils down to the moral dilemma. 2 cities full of civilians were completely pulverized. Entire families were gone in an instant, while many others were left to die in excruciating pain. The sheer amount of terror, pain, and suffering that occurred in those 2 cities is impossible to imagine. Of course, non-nuclear bombs were already being dropped on cities, and in an all-out invasion, thousands of civilians may have been killed anyway, perhaps even more than the 2 bombs killed. Nonetheless, if I were the president, there is just no way I can make the call to drop those bombs, regardless of the fact that it could bring a swift end to the war. Perhaps it's best I wasn't the president, as since then Japan has undergone a dramatic transformation from a devastated, militaristic nation to one of the world's most advanced, peaceful, and prosperous countries. They were quickly demilitarized, and the economy was rebuilt with a new constitution put in place. Had the bombs not been dropped, the Soviets may have invaded and taken over the North. Reconstruction would have been more difficult, delayed, or may have not happened at all. Perhaps it may have only happened in the South, while the North would have been like North Korea is today. And of course, how many American lives would have been lost in a ground invasion of Japan? Thousands of men and women who went on to live full lives, some of whom are still alive today, that might have been killed in Japan. way back in the 1940s. So whether Truman should have or should not have dropped the bomb is one of the most debated questions in U.S. history, and there is no simple answer. But for me, war should never be about killing civilians, and sometimes wrong is just wrong. My opinion is that Truman should have tried to find another way to end the war as quickly as possible. Indiscriminate mass killings should never be an acceptable option. Thousands of innocent civilians were killed or brutally injured, not because they happened to be close to a military target and got caught in the crossfire. Instead, atomic bombs were dropped intentionally right into their cities, into their homes, or at their places of work. And my secondary reasoning is the precedent set, as it introduced nuclear warfare to the world, and any other country that decides to drop a nuclear bomb, well, they won't be the first to do it. So from a humanitarian and moral perspective, I disagree with Truman's decision, but from a practical perspective, and looking at how Japan ended up decades later, plus considering all the US lives that were saved, I certainly see why so many people say that there was no other choice. Let me know your thoughts in that comment section down below, and we'll talk to y'all in the next video.